Okay, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is John Asana, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center. Today's webinar is titled Trees' Surprising Role in the Boreal Water Cycle, and we are excited to have Jesse Young-Robertson and Uma Bhatt from the University of Alaska Fairbanks with us today. So, let's get started. And to start things off, please join me in welcoming Elda Varela-Minder, who is a research associate with NCCWSC, who will be introducing our speakers today. Elda?
Thank you, yes, and welcome to everyone. Jessica Young-Robertson is a research assistant professor at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. While she worked on her undergraduate degree in biology from Fort Lewis College, she was a field technician on avian nesting studies in the southwest U.S., Montana, and Louisiana. She then got her MS and PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology with a minor in global change at the University of Arizona. Her research focused on the effects of changes in precipitation and vegetation on soil ecological processes in the Sonoran Desert. She did a postdoc at the University of Wyoming, where she developed strong modeling skills while analyzing extensive soil carbon data sets from the 7 North American deserts. A second postdoc funded through the National Science Foundation led to her work in Alaska, where she started exploring how boreal forests, plants, and ecosystems use, move, and store water. She is fascinated by the role that tree water use can play in large-scale processes in the boreal forest. And Uma Bhatt is the chair of the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and Geophysical Institute and the director of the Cooperative Institute for Alaska Research at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. After completing her undergraduate degrees in mechanical engineering and Russian language, she served in the U.S. Peace Corps as a teacher in rural Kenya, where she experienced amazing weather phenomena, as well as the East Africa drought of 1983 through 85. This is what led her to become a climate scientist. She attended the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where her MS focused on tropical meteorology, and her PhD incorporated global climate models to study mid-latitude air-sea interaction. Since joining the University of Alaska Fairbanks, she teaches and conducts research that focuses on Arctic climate issues. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about a paper that was recently published in Nature Scientific Reports on the surprising role of trees in the boreal water cycles. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Bob Bolton, Uma Bhatt, Jordi Cristobal, and Rick Toman. Rick is with the National Weather Service, and the rest of us are with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So Bob Bolton and I have worked together for a very long time, and our primary research goal has been to understand the ecological and hydrological interactions in the boreal forest. So the field of ecohydrology has been fairly well developed in other ecosystems, but really not in the far north. And so we've been trying to make these connections in the boreal forest. And working with Jordi, Uma, and Rick, we are all ultimately interested in the interaction with climate and the feedbacks. So throughout the talk, you're going to see these photographs of the boreal forest that are taken in the autumn. And that's because it's the best time to see the striking differences between the different ecotones. So the Alaskan landscape is ecologically diverse and hydrologically complex. So on the left-hand side, you can see Alaska and all the various ecosystem types throughout Alaska. For this study, we were primarily interested in most of interior Alaska, including the western parts of Canada. And the dominant ecosystem types are coniferous and deciduous forests, which you can see in the yellow and green colors on the map on the right. So when we talk about scaling later on in the talk, we're referring to this region. And so these two main vegetation types cover a significant part of the landscape, and this area is underlain with discontinuous permafrost. What that means is essentially the permafrost that's beneath the soil surface isn't everywhere, not ubiquitous. So thinking about the map we saw on the previous page, the deciduous-dominated ecosystems, so this would be aspen, birch, nostrils, and poplar, cover about 61% of the landscape. And the coniferous-dominated, so black spruce, but also white spruce, cover about 38% of the landscape. Now, These are really interesting ecosystems because they're so different and they lie right next to each other, just meters apart. So the coniferous-dominated ecosystems, they're typically found on north-facing slopes and valley bottoms. The soils are very wet and cold, and they're typically underlain by permafrost. The trees typically have low physiological activity. Now this is in direct contrast to the deciduous vegetation. The soils are dry and pretty warm. They're typically not underlain by permafrost. And the trees have very high physiological activity relative to the coniferous trees. So when you take all of these things and put them together, you can see that these ecosystems might have a very different relationship between ecological and hydrological processes. So here's a drawing, I'd say, of a typical boreal watershed with mixed vegetation, and obviously this is a cross-section. So on the left-hand side, let me see if I can use this pointer. Here. The gray blob there is permafrost. And you can see up top there, I say it's a north-facing slope or valley bottom is where permafrost is found. And atop that, we have seasonally thawed soil layer. And on top of that, we primarily have black spruce, coniferous vegetation, and also typically a mossy understory. Now, the seasonally thawed soil layer is quite thin at the beginning of the summer, and then we reach a fairly deep thaw by autumn. And in a lot of the areas we study, the thaw is about 1 meter to 1.5 meters deep. And these soils have a thick organic layer, and then below that a mineral layer. Now if we go across the valley, see if I can get us there, we see that we have quite a different ecosystem. And there we have mineral soil, very thin organic layer, there's no permafrost, and there's typically fractured bedrock. Now the typical vegetation are deciduous trees. You will see some conifers, but primarily deciduous vegetation. We're talking birch, aspen, and poplar. And these are predominantly south-facing slopes. So we can see there's a very different ecosystem. And so what we're thinking about and what has led Bob and I through much of our work and into this paper is that we want to know, where does the water go when it enters an ecosystem? Where is it stored? So in the soil, the plants, or even deep in the soil in the aquifer. And which compartments does it move through and when? And so how are the vegetation interacting with other parts of the system to affect where water goes? So thinking about this ecology-hydrology interaction, a significant uncertainty in boreal forest ecohydrology, and arguably just boreal hydrology, is the role of vegetation water use in removing and storing water, thereby affecting water availability for stream flow and then ultimately affecting climate dynamics. So if we return to that drawing we had a couple of slides ago, here I have 3 versions of it, and essentially it's as the system moves through the seasons. So the spring snowmelt period is the top, the growing season is the center, and autumn is the lower part. And the blue lines, or the blue arrows, depict where we think water is going. And these were our initial hypotheses when thinking about the ecohydrology of these systems. So on the left-hand side, where we have permafrost and coniferous vegetation, we hypothesize that the hydrological processes are going to be dominated by what's going on in that seasonal soil thaw. So it's really the depth of that thaw that's going to affect where the water is going. So you can imagine moisture on the left-hand side comes into the system. It hits an icy layer, it moves laterally through the system and generates stream flow. And then as the seasons progress, as we move into autumn, that seasonally thawed layer is getting deeper and deeper, but the moisture still comes in, it reaches an icy layer and moves laterally out of the system. Now, if we focus on the right-hand side of these figures, we have these deciduous forests. So in the spring snowmelt period, we always hypothesize that because there's no leaves on the trees, they're not really participating in the water cycle. And so the snow melts and moves down into the soil, generates some stream flow, but largely just moves into deeper soil layers. During the growing season, when the leaves are present, we hypothesize the trees do participate. Rain comes into a system, the trees take it up and transpire it to the atmosphere. And then in the autumn, we suspected because the leaves aren't quite as active, moisture moves into the system and just keeps moving through. So we suspect that much of the hydrological processes in these deciduous ecosystems without permafrost are probably dominated by vegetation and their activity. So if we think about what we already know about boreal tree water use, which by the way is not very much, John Yeary at UAF and his team have shown that deciduous trees rely heavily on snowmelt water. They did a complete snow exclusion on some plots and a complete rain exclusion on other plots. They excluded snow for 5 years, and they showed that it basically resulted in tree death. They excluded rain for 20 some odd years. It didn't kill the trees. It shifted some dynamics in the plots, but it didn't kill the trees. Now, they didn't measure any of the actual tree water balance components, but this sent a pretty clear message that snowmelt water is very important for particularly deciduous trees. Now, add to this part, snowmelt is the most important part of the water balance. This is not part of what John Urey's group showed, but this is just generally known to the hydrological community, and this is important for our story. Now, what Bob and I have shown, and I'll show you in a graph in the next slide, is that deciduous trees transpire an order of magnitude more water compared to coniferous trees, especially during dry times. So this is a loud graph, but on the left-hand side we see red lines, and on the right-hand side we see green ones. So on the left-hand side, these are transpiration rates from deciduous trees, and the different colored lines just are from sites that are positioned differently on the landscape, but they're all deciduous trees. And on the right-hand side is the transpiration rates from coniferous trees. The real take-home point here is that if you look at the y-axes on all these graphs, you can see that the deciduous trees are transpiring an order of magnitude more water than the coniferous trees. So this is the same slide I showed you just 2 slides ago, but we added on to it. So the other thing that we know is the soils in deciduous forests, they just don't store water well. So if we take all of this together, we know the deciduous trees, they do rely on snowmelt water. We know they use a lot of water. We know they live on soil that doesn't store a lot of water. So how can these trees sustain high transpiration rates during dry periods? Are they using water they stored in their trunks that they took up during snowmelt? So these are some basic questions we just don't know. And the way to think about organisms that have to function in places that are dry is that I think of, they all have to have a reservoir they drink from, whether they're their own camel or they're drinking from some other pot of water. And it's clear they're probably not using the soil as their reservoir, so maybe they're using their trunks as the reservoir. So the primary research questions that are within the paper that we studied are, if these boreal trees are using snowmelt water stored in their trunks, how much are they using and storing? Do they use the water over the summer to support transpiration during dry times? And how do deciduous trees compare to coniferous trees? And again, I want you to have in the back of your mind that these organisms are trying to find a way to have a water pool they sip from in order to support themselves during stressful times. So think of it as that pool of water is a buffering agent. So sort of briefly, what we measured was tree water content, soil moisture, tree stand characteristics over a couple summers in an interior Alaskan boreal forest watershed. And then we scaled these data to the landscape level. I want to talk a little bit about plant water use. There's a lot of terms that float around that are used interchangeably, but they shouldn't be. So evapotranspiration is the water vapor loss from the surface to the atmosphere. And evaporation is a physical process of loss of water from moss, soil, and open water. And transpiration is actually a physiological process, so it's controlled by living organisms. And this is how a tree can actually affect climate, and one of the ways it can. And transpiration pulls water from a stored source, so from the trunk, which is ultimately pulled from the soil. So evapotranspiration is the sum of these two processes. Now, transpiration is actually a flux. And what we looked at in this study is tree water content. And what this is, it's the volume of water that's stored in the trunk. So it's the net of water that's supplied from the roots and then transpired to the atmosphere. So it's like your checking account. Money comes in, money goes out, and what's left over is your checking, is the net balance in your account. And that's what we're looking at, is the water content that's stored. So first I'll talk about the field research that we did, and then I'll talk about our findings as it was scaled to the landscape. So we did our work at Caribou Poker Creek Research Watershed. This is in interior Alaska. It's part of the LTER network, the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. We set up 4 sites in a watershed with mixed vegetation. We set up 2 sites on the north-facing slope. This area has permafrost and coniferous trees with a mossy understory. We set up 2 sites on the south-facing slope. That's the one in the purple. And this area does not have permafrost. It does have near-surface bedrock, and has deciduous trees, primarily aspen and birch. And the 2 positions that we picked within each forest type is both high and low on the hill slope. That's not necessarily relevant for the results we'll show. We just needed you to know that. So our approach for measuring tree water content It was measured weekly or semi-weekly for several summers, but will only show results for 2013 and 2014. Our instruments were installed in black spruce on north-facing sites and birch and aspen on south-facing sites. We used a time domain reflectometry approach. This was typically used to measure soil moisture, but we went on ahead and put them in the trees. We lab calibrated the instruments using logs that we cut. We analyzed data from 2013 and 2014. We also conducted additional stand characterization measurements for the scaling, as you'll see. We measured soil moisture at 2 depths and additional meteorological data that we won't end up talking about. So this figure just sort of steps you through some of the data and how it was all merged together. So we developed an allometric relationship between tree height and circumference to determine tree volume, and this is throughout the stand. And then we scaled that to the stand and got stand volume, and we incorporated tree water content that we measured on many, many trees. So we got stand level water volume. And then we had a database of snow depth and density throughout Alaska to calculate snow water equivalent. And again, we focused on non-coastal areas and not the North Slope. And then we also got estimates of land area covered by coniferous and deciduous trees. And we used a Bayesian statistical analysis approach so that we could take uncertainty from all these different data sets and propagate it throughout our calculations. So in the end, we actually have uncertainty estimates for our scaling data. So we do have some assumptions for the scaling that we want to put out there. One is that the tree volumes are calculated as cylinders. So obviously trees are not cylinders, but we're lucky with these trees. They have a pretty significant branching pattern up top. So while the trunks taper, if we include all the rest of that volume, we make the assumption that it's equivalent to a cylinder. All the deciduous trees outside our research area attain the same level of wood saturation prior to leaf out. So what you're going to see in the next graph is these trees get really saturated. So we had to make the assumption that all the trees that we're scaling to reach that same level of saturation, the deciduous trees. Well, this is very easy to test because when they get saturated, you can just go hammer a hole in a tree and it gushes out water. And that's a very easy thing to do to a lot of trees in an area. And we've walked around and done that for several different trees in different locations. And sure enough, it's pretty universal. And also, we assume the density of trees at our research site is representative of stand densities in other parts of Alaska, again, non-coastal areas. This one's a bit tricky. We know in any ecosystem you go into, it's going to be heterogeneous, and we feel fairly confident that our watershed is representative of many parts of the boreal forest. So that's one of the assumptions. And the final assumption is that the trees are taking up snowmelt water, not another source of water, prior to leaf out. And the trees are taking up the current year's snowmelt water rather than stored moisture. There's a few reasons why we're comfortable with this assumption. One is John Yerry's study showing their reliance in taking up of snowmelt water. Another thing that we rely on is that these soils don't actually store a lot of water, so they have to take up whatever water is immediately available. And it's that snowmelt water that actually has enough volume to create the situations that we're able to see in the trees. Okay. Now onto the data. So these are data from our field sites. On the left, they're both graphs of soil moisture at 5 centimeters. The 40 centimeter data I went on ahead and removed. It wasn't terribly relevant. On the left-hand side, we have the deciduous ecosystem soil moisture, and on the right-hand side, we have it for the coniferous system. We're showing it for 2 years, 2013 in the black and 2014 in the green. And the asterisks in each case show the end of snowmelt. So what we see is soil moisture starts out quite low, and then it actually saturates the soil in both cases, and that's from snowmelt. And then we see a drop-off in soil moisture after that period. And now what I'm showing you is the tree water content. It's a volumetric water content. And the circles are the deciduous trees, and the triangles are the coniferous trees. And I've indicated on the x-axis when leaf out occurred in each year. And each of those points actually do have error bars. The data are just nicely constrained. What we see is that if we focus on the deciduous trees, they start out at about 35–40% water content, and then they start to get saturated, and they increase in water content to a point until they leaf out, and then water content declines. And what you can see in 2014 is the water content actually stayed pretty high, and that's because 2014 was actually one of the wettest years on record. So they are taking up rainfall a bit later on there. What we see with the coniferous trees and the triangles is they actually do take up water there early in the season, and then they stay pretty constant at about 50% water content. So we can already see some pretty significant differences between these two tree types. The deciduous ones get saturated and they stay very, very wet. Coniferous ones, they sit at about 50% water content, and they don't seem to be responding that much to variability in climate, which is what we think is driving the variability in the water content data for the deciduous trees. So what we see for the deciduous trees is they reach saturation before they even leaf out. So they're moving that water before the leaves are on the trees. And we'll follow up with this, but you'll also notice that 10 to 20% of the stored water is transpired to the atmosphere in the first 1 to 2 weeks after leaf out. So if you see that, let's see if I can get the arrow to work. You see this kind of peak time in both years, they transpire quite a bit of water in the first 1 to 2 weeks. So this is two graphs from the prior slide. The top one is soil moisture from the deciduous system. The bottom one is water content from both systems. And you'll notice that I put those two red lines in there, and what they indicate is where the peak of the tree water content occurs for each year. And I lined it up with the soil moisture graph above it. So what you can see is soil moisture increases quite a bit. So at this point, we know that the trees are taking up the snowmelt water. So what we went on ahead and did is calculate the percent snowmelt water actually taken up within each of these ecosystem types. So on the left-hand side, we have the deciduous ecosystem, and on the right-hand side, we have the coniferous ones for both years. And what we see, and the error bars are actually the 95% credible intervals. And what we see is that the deciduous trees are taking up 21 to 25% of the snowmelt water within their given ecosystem. And the coniferous trees are taking up less than 1%. So this is we found this to be pretty mind-blowing, and it's a really significant difference for one thing, but the other part of this is that this is so far has gone unquantified. Next slide. So now we should have the graph up of the landscape scaling results. And on the y-axis, we have the tree water in cubic meters, and this is the volume. So this is the seasonal pattern will look the same as the field data that we collected, but what's interesting here is the sheer volume of water that we're talking about. So again, the triangles are the coniferous trees, and I expanded that graph below so that you could see what the pattern is. But the volume is tremendous. So if we go to the next slide, again, reiterating the plants are transpiring about 10% of the snowmelt water in the 1 to 2 weeks after leaf out. That's about 0.4 to 2.2 billion cubic meters of water. And then from that period until the midsummer, that's an additional 2 to 5.2 billion cubic meters of water. So this is a tremendous amount of water, and you'll see that especially if we go to the next slide. This slide should be snowmelt water uptake at the maximum water content. So that's when you saw in those prior graphs, you saw a peak in the water content. So this is the volume of water at that peak. And again, we can see huge differences between the deciduous and coniferous trees. Again, this is one of our scaling numbers. What we see is that deciduous trees are taking up at that peak. They have about 17 to about 21 billion cubic meters of snowmelt water that they've taken up. And the coniferous is about 32 to 33 million cubic meters. And so this is a pretty vast difference between these two tree types, in part because the deciduous trees cover more land area, but really this is because they take up and move a whole lot more water. Next slide. So the next question that we asked with this analysis is, how can disturbance change the story? And so we know that across the globe, basically, we're seeing vegetation change, all sorts of things, including shrub encroachment. What we're seeing up here is actually a deciduous tree expansion. So if we move into the next slide, we see that deciduous trees and shrubs, they cover about 61% of the vegetated Alaskan landscape. And they are expanding in area. So if we go to the next slide, this is a landscape level phenomenon, and it's actually related to disturbance. So if we have disturbance, you increase deciduous plant cover. So here I have different things shown. We have thermokarst, hillside detachment, active layer destabilization, fire, and on the north slope we even have shrub encroachment related to thawing ice wedges and warming soil. So one thing a lot of these disturbances have in common is that they affect the soil thermal and moisture regime, and it creates a really nice environment for deciduous vegetation. So fire is a big one, and fires are a really important process in the boreal forest. It's predicted to increase in intensity and extent. And what occurs after fire almost unanimously is that we get, or ubiquitously I should say, is that we get these deciduous saplings. So in the bottom right-hand corner, it's dense with aspen and birch saplings. So that's a major agent of change. If we go to the next slide, so we asked this question with our data, and we said, what if we get an increase in deciduous cover by 1%, 5%, 10, or 15%? And these are well within the possibility associated with wildfire and the changes that they can cause. And so our calculations are that it could increase the snowmelt water uptake by 0.3 to 3 billion additional cubic meters of water. Next slide. So we're on to our conclusions. So I think we've shown here that the deciduous trees in the boreal forest, they play a huge role in the water cycle, and this was previously unquantified. Tree water storage is typically ignored in hydrology models. It's actually usually part of a vague error term. And snowmelt, at least in the deciduous systems, is typically assumed to primarily recharge groundwater. And what we're showing here is we need to rethink that, at least in the boreal forest, where there's no permafrost and we have deciduous vegetation. We showed that the trees take up 25% of the snowmelt water within their ecosystems. And this is about 15 to 20 billion cubic meters of water. And this is actually equivalent to 8.7 to 10% of the Yukon River's discharge. So it's a large amount of water. They transpire 10 to 20%, or 0.4 to 2.2 billion cubic meters of water in the 1 to 2 weeks after leaf out. They also transpire an additional 2 to 5 billion cubic meters of water between leaf out and the midsummer period. So they appear to be utilizing their stored snowmelt water in the trunks over the summer, and rain does not appear to be as important as snow. And we also showed that the increased distribution of deciduous vegetation will likely increase the amount of snowmelt water used by boreal forests. So there's still a lot more work to do, and we have some ongoing work now to explore this deciduous water use story a bit more, but we can see that as a tip of the iceberg, this is pretty significant. So of course, if they're transpiring that much water to the atmosphere, especially in such a short amount of time right after leaf out, we have to ask, what is the impact on climate? So if we go to the next slide, this is right before I hand it off to Uma. So transpiration and climate. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we see some figures from Jasheko, and they did a meta-analysis of transpiration from as many sites as they could around the globe. And relative to evaporation, transpiration is fairly significant on the global scale. So if you look at the top panel of that figure of the globe with a lot of the blue shading, we see that transpiration can make up 90% of the total evapotranspiration flux. This is extremely significant. It means the vegetation are playing a really big role, possibly in climate. And transpiration can impact climate. A good case study is the Amazon. Evapotranspiration can recycle 20 to 35% of the rainfall. So essentially rain falls on the system. The plants take it up. It also gets evaporated from surface waters, and it goes back into the atmosphere, and then it rains back down. And so a significant part of this is transpiration. And transpiration can impact climate anywhere plants flux a lot, particularly if it's a dry climate or a drier time of year. So I'm going to hand it off to Uma, and if you could go to the next slide, please.
So now we're going to look at some of the kind of our baseline calculations of how these large amounts of moisture can potentially impact the atmosphere. So the two plots that I've shown here, the dark green line showed hourly temperature at Fairbanks Airport for 4 days, and I've highlighted where green up occurred. The left plot is 2013, and the right plot is 2014. And in light green, I'm showing the dew point temperature, and dew point temperature tells us how much moisture there is in the atmosphere. It's the temperature at which all the moisture would condense. So the higher the dew point, the more moisture there is. And one thing that, the Weather Service folks have noticed is as soon as things green up, the dew point goes up. And it's a little bit hard to tease from this hourly data, but it shows up really nicely in 2013. Doesn't show up quite as well in 2014 because it occurred actually much earlier when it was generally cooler and there wasn't as strong a diurnal cycle in the temperatures. And one of the things folks notice is there's puffy clouds soon after green up. So we're seeing potentially our hypothesis is this is linked to green up and this respiration now that we know what these numbers are. And when you put moisture into the atmosphere, you're putting energy into the atmosphere because as those moist air parcels move around, rise up in the atmosphere and they cool, that water condenses and that releases heat into the atmosphere. And that heat can then promote convective activity. So rising motion, we get our beautiful convective clouds. And on the next slide, these convective clouds have implications for, the climate. And this is a seasonal cycle from January through December of a long-term climatology of precipitable water. And it's from one data source, the NCEP-NCAR reanalysis. It's a combination of model and observations. And what this shows is how much water is there in a column above a box over Alaska? Not exactly the box Jesse used, but a box over the boreal forest. And I've highlighted here May, which is the time of year when we typically have green up. And the values of all the moisture in the column, pretty much if you scale it, adds up to about 8 billion meters cubed of water. And so you can see that the values of, that Jesse showed of 0.4 to 2.4 billion cubic meters being released at green up, and then throughout the summer when it peaks 2 to 5 billion. These are, a substantial portion of this 8 billion in May and roughly twice as much during the peak of the season. So again, this moisture that's getting injected in the springtime, depending on when it gets injected, the atmosphere is relatively dry at that time of year, so it's not likely to really lead to big thunderstorms. But when we think about the climate warming, and if you shift this seasonal cycle a bit, if there's a generally warmer climate and when the plants green up, there's the potential to start convective activity. And then the reason the convective activity feeds back potentially onto the vegetation is that convective activity is associated with lightning, and it poses an ignition risk for wildland fire. So I think having these observations really highlights a potential for a rich interaction between the vegetation and the climate now as well as it changes. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
And thank you, Jesse and Uma. And at this time, if you guys have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box.
This is Lynn. Sorry, I'm in a noisy place, but that was great. I guess I was just thought maybe it could push you a little bit farther about how this might be used, not just for this really fascinating results, might be used not just for informational purposes, for identifying places, but potentially on this cutting edge that Jessica Lundquist's group is leading us all into, of thinking about patching up forests and maybe keeping heterogeneity of moisture on the land, sort of forcing heterogeneity of moisture on the landscape. Is that something that you might speak to?
I guess I don't know much about it. Can you elaborate a little and we can give it a try?
Just to say, do you think that this could maybe lead to some adaptation action of how you might manage the forest differently, and trying to maybe encourage different forest types given the information of how these trees hold moisture in different seasons?
It's a good question. And what's interesting, to back up a little bit, is there's not a lot of forest management throughout interior Alaska, in part because we don't have much of a forestry industry. But in terms of maybe thinking hypothetically about it, one thing that we can kind of speak to is that, and this is a question that we've gotten, is that if we have more deciduous vegetation and they add to the convection of the atmosphere, we might have more lightning strikes and wildfire. What interesting feedback is that deciduous vegetation are very, very wet, and they're actually hard to burn. And so that could change the fire dynamics within the boreal forest. So that's not human management, but it's just maybe a potentially different trajectory that the forest could be on if we get more fires. We might actually get less fires if we get a vegetation change. In terms of management, this isn't directly forest management. It's more maybe thinking about using like engineered ecosystems for human purposes. But I have heard of people trying to use deciduous vegetation to help dry the soil in certain places. So one use of that was a group was they were looking at, I think, clay-capped landfills or something, and it was getting too wet, and so they planted deciduous vegetation to help dry the soil. And so in terms of managing soil moisture, like in a human-engineered system, we could use deciduous vegetation. But in terms of having these two forest types relative to each other on the landscape, I guess I don't have a direct answer for that one. One thing that is kind of interesting to think about, at least their proximity next to each other, and the landscape heterogeneity and moisture and vegetation type, is that I get the feeling that the black spruce forests tend to have a lot of sensible heat flux, and the deciduous forests tend to have more latent heat flux. And so I think when you put those two forest types together, they can at least affect the atmosphere, because the sensible heat could provide lift for the latent heat, or for the moisture moving to the atmosphere. So it's sort of a roundabout answer with a lot of different components to it, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. If there aren't any more questions, once again, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating, and once again, thank you to Jesse and Uma for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.